the gentle fog of forgotten highs. Close your eyes and imagine a world dimly lit by candlelight, heavy with the scent of damp stone and burning herbs. A place where people whispered prayers not just to saints, but to plants, to roots, to dreams. Long before modern chemistry, before pharmacies and pill bottles, there were leaves and berries. There were powders carried in linen pouches, smokes drawn from crooked pipes, and bitter brews steeped in iron pots hanging over open fires. And with them came visions. This is not a story of rebellion or modern indulgence. It's a story of survival, of mysticism, of pain, and the quiet ways people tried to escape it. In the medieval world, getting high wasn't a party, it was often a ritual, a medicine, the prayer. In times of plague and famine, when a cough could mean death and childbirth was a gamble, people turned to the earth beneath their feet. They gathered plants with strange names and stranger effects. They boiled, inhaled, consumed, and sometimes simply hoped. But they were not scientists. They were farmers, nuns, herbalists, midwives, soldiers, and wanderers. And yet, their understanding of the plants that numbed pain or stretched reality was rooted in generations of experience, passed down not in textbooks, but in whispers. Some of what they used would today be labeled dangerous, even toxic. Henbane, mandrake, nightshade, plants with a reputation. But to them, these were tools of healing, and sometimes of reaching another world. There were no warnings on the labels. There were no labels. In this journey, we will walk through those cold, muddy alleys and into silent stone chambers. We'll enter the smoky homes of peasants and the libraries of monks. We'll read old recipes, examine forgotten rituals, and meet the quiet figures who dared to touch the edge of the unseen. We will not rush, because this is not history meant to wake you up. It is history to guide you gently into dreams. Let us begin. The roots of euphoria, plants, pain, and prayers. In the quiet soil of forgotten centuries, beneath frost-touched fields and damp monastery gardens, the roots of medieval euphoria slowly curled their way through the earth. They were not cultivated for profit or pleasure, but for something simpler, something older, relief. To live in the Middle Ages was to live with pain. The pain of cold winters without firewood, the pain of broken bones that never quite healed, of childbirth without aid, of sicknesses that had no names and no cures. And so, people turned to what they had, the land. Long before the idea of getting high was tied to rebellion or recreation, it was bound to necessity. Painkillers were rare. Anesthesia, as we know it, did not exist. There were no surgeons in every village, no hospitals on every corner. What there was nature. From the corners of forests and the edges of meadows, villagers gathered leaves, barks, roots, and resins. Some were sweet-smelling, some were bitter, some burned the throat, and some blurred the line between waking and dreaming. The most trusted knowledge did not come from kings or nobles, but from grandmothers, from herbalists, from those who had seen many deaths and knew which plants could soften the agony of the dying. They whispered names that now feel half mythical. Valerian, henbane, mandrake, yarrow. They knew which needed to be picked under a full moon, which had to be dried in shade, and which must never be mixed with wine, unless you wanted to hear voices that were not your own. Each plant had a purpose. Some were used to soothe a crying child. Others were for women in labor. Some were for wounded soldiers returned from distant battles with injuries that could not be seen. And a few were used for something harder to name. Those were the plants for sorrow, for restlessness, for the ache that lives not in the body, but in the soul. You see, even in the 12th century, people struggled with sadness. They may not have called it depression, but they knew what it was to feel hollow. They knew sleeplessness. They knew the weight of grief that never truly passed. In those cases, a special kind of herb was offered, one that didn't just numb pain, but transported the mind. It might start with warmth in the stomach, a flush to the cheeks, then perhaps laughter, or tears, or silence, a silence that could last for hours, while the fire turned to coals and the stars outside flickered through smoky windows. Not every high was dramatic. Sometimes it was just a lifting of the heavy veil. Just enough to sleep. Just enough to forget. But with these plants came caution. A child who drank too much henbane tea might never wake again. A soldier who chewed wild nightshade to stop his pain might fall into a sleep from which he would never rise. And yet they kept using them, because pain, left untreated, was its own kind of death. A slower one. The church looked on warily. Some monks believed these plants were divine gifts, tools to connect with God. Others called them temptations, even gateways for demons. In some monasteries, you would find well-kept herb gardens and careful records. In others, you would find firewood stacked high and warnings against the devil's root. But outside the abbeys, in villages where winters were long and doctors were far, belief and need blurred into practice. Women tied bundles of dried leaves with bits of string. They hung them above cradles. They boiled them into broths. They tucked them into the pockets of dying men. And still today, if you walk through certain parts of Europe in spring, you may find those same plants growing quietly. Their roots still deep, their stories still intact, forgotten by many, but remembered by the land. This is where it began, not with pills, not with chemicals, but with roots, and silence, and prayer. Let us now step deeper into the world of those plants that didn't just dull pain, but open doors. The hallucinogenic garden, when reality wasn't enough. Imagine a garden not made for beauty, but for transformation. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and crushed leaves. The sun is low, casting long shadows across rows of plants that seem to pulse with a kind of quiet power. This is not a garden you stumble into by accident. It is hidden, walled, often kept by those who do not speak loudly about what they grow. For in this garden, reality was not the only destination. Sometimes, it was the starting point. Here, plants were chosen not for their fragrance or flavor, but for their ability to unfasten the mind from its moorings. These were the hallucinogens of the Middle Ages, not labeled as such, of course. They were called by names that drifted between Latin and local dialects. They were known less for their chemical compositions and more for their effects whispered about in stories. The most famous among them was perhaps mandrake, a root that resembled the human form, said to scream when pulled from the earth. Tales told of death falling upon any who heard its cry. But beyond the myths, mandrake was used carefully in potions and sleep draughts. In small doses, it could bring calm. In larger ones, it could deliver visions, or unconsciousness, or both. Then there was henbane, its yellow flowers curling like secret smiles. Known to cause dizziness, confusion, and vivid dreams, it was sometimes used before certain rituals, those that required a letting go of the ordinary world. Datura, too, made its rounds in gardens and graveyards. It could unlock the gates of memory or madness. To those with knowledge, these plants were doors, but doors that required caution, reverence, and restraint. To step through them was not a game, it was a risk. In some circles, these plants were used for divination. A woman might chew a bit of dried belladonna before a visioning. A monk might burn leaves in a brazier and breathe the smoke during night vigils. Some said it helped them see the future. Others said it helped them face the past. But not every journey was safe. There were stories, many, of people who went too far, who drank the wrong tea or mixed the wrong herbs and never quite returned. A hunter who returned from the forest speaking in tongues. A widow who danced in the street for 3 days before collapsing into silence. A child who spoke of winged beings in the rafters and would not sleep indoors again. These stories, passed in hushed tones, served both as warning and allure. For as much as people feared these plants, they also desired what they offered: escape. And not just escape from pain. Escape from rules. From hunger. From grief. From the heavy weight of the known world. You see, medieval life was bounded by walls. Walls of religion, class, superstition. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. But the mind, especially under the influence of certain roots and resins, could wander. And it wandered far. To places where the dead whispered through trees. Where angels danced through the firelight. Where beasts spoke in riddles and rivers reversed their flow. These were not hallucinations to those who experienced them. They were messages, insights, sometimes punishments, but always real. Even those who feared such practices acknowledged their power. Bishops wrote of the dreaming sickness. Soldiers warned of battle phantoms seen by men who chewed strange bark before charging into war. Healers spoke of patients who saw loved ones long dead, just before recovering, or just before dying. In some places, such visions were embraced, celebrated even. In others, they were feared, and the practitioners hidden, punished, or worse. But always, these plants were there. In the corners of fields, in pots on windowsills, growing wild beneath the moonlight. They were part of life. And of something larger than life. They were the garden gates between worlds. And though most who passed through returned safely, not all did. Let us now turn to how people crossed those thresholds. How they consumed, breathed, drank, and wandered, sometimes by accident, sometimes by intention, into altered states. Potions, pipes, and perfumed smoke, the medieval methods of altered mind. The journey into the unknown rarely began with a leap. It began with preparation, with care, with ceremony. If you were to wander into a 13th century cottage on the edge of the forest, you might find a woman standing over a steaming pot. Not cooking food, not making dye, but brewing a concoction whose ingredients you would not recognize, and whose scent would stir something deep and wordless within you. This was not a tea. This was not a remedy. This was a passage. In the Middle Ages, the act of altering the mind was not so much recreational as it was sacred or desperate. Either way, it was rarely done casually. The substances used could not be bought in shops. They had to be found, foraged, dried, prepared. And that process alone was enough to instill respect, if not fear. The potion was perhaps the most common method. Roots were sliced thin and soaked in wine. Leaves were crushed with oils. Powders were sifted through cloth. Sometimes honey was added to mask bitterness. Sometimes vinegar to draw out hidden properties. The liquid that resulted might be thick and dark, like ink, or pale and cloudy, like dawn milk. It was often consumed in silence or with a whispered phrase. Half prayer, half warning. The dose was everything. 1 spoonful might bring warmth and calm. 2 might unlock dreams. 3 could bring sleep that looked, to an outsider, indistinguishable from death. But not all methods were liquid. Smoke, too, played its part. In hearths and fire pits, dried herbs were laid atop coals and stirred with iron pokers. The smoke that rose filled the small rooms with scent, sometimes sharp and peppery, sometimes sweet and cloying, sometimes almost invisible until it struck the lungs. People inhaled through hollow reeds, through clay pipes, through cupped hands, sometimes simply by breathing the air after a curtain had been drawn and the door sealed shut. And as they breathed, they waited for the shift. The shift often came slowly. The flicker of a candle would begin to stretch unnaturally. Sounds in the next room would grow closer then distant, then layered like a chant. Time would pool at your feet, thick and motionless. And then came the visions. Others preferred the use of ointments. These were mixtures rubbed on the skin, most often on the temples, the inner arms, the soles of the feet. The ingredients were absorbed slowly, through pores, carried by the blood into the mind's more hidden rooms. There are records, fragile, incomplete, of flying ointments used by women accused of witchcraft. The formulas varied, but most included nightshade, poppy, fat, and sometimes bat's blood or ash. Whether they truly flew or simply believed they did, the sensations described were vivid. The wind on the skin, the spinning trees, the voice of the moon. And then there were incenses and burning resins, used in monasteries as well as in pagan circles. Myrrh, frankincense, pine tar, and more obscure substances like storax or galbanum. These were burned during long vigils, especially on cold nights. The smoke was thought to help the soul rise, the mind detach, to encourage dreams even while still awake. Not all who used these methods sought visions. Some sought relief. A mother trying to ease the agony of a dying child. A man seeking peace after battle. A woman trying to sleep after burying her third husband. In such cases, the altered state was not a destination, it was a place to rest. But others, seers, midwives, mystics, sought the experience itself. They believed that to see was to know, to feel was to understand, and to travel inward was to return outward, wiser. Still, the risks never faded. The boundary between healing and harm was always thin, always shifting. A fire too hot could burn the herbs. A leaf too old could be inert. A pinch too much, and the visions became torment. There was no certainty, only experimentation and faith. And so, in stone huts and forest groves, in abbeys and barns, medieval people inhaled, swallowed, rubbed, burned, and prayed. Sometimes they spoke of angels, sometimes of beasts, sometimes of nothing at all. But always, in those moments of altered mind, they stepped outside the ordinary world. And when they returned, if they returned, they brought something with them. A story, a lesson, a silence, a stare. Let us now walk with those who guided others through these strange journeys. The healers, the midwives, the monks, and the wanderers who kept the old ways. The keepers of secrets, healers, monks, and women of the edge. In every village, there were those who knew more than they said. They did not wear crowns or command armies. They did not live in castles. Their homes were tucked at the edges of woods, near the rivers, or just beyond the market square, where the road turned to mud. They were the ones people went to when nothing else worked. When prayers to saints brought no answers. When the physician had packed his bags and moved on. These were the keepers of secrets. They were called many names, some kind, some cruel. Healer, herbalist, wise woman, cunning man, green nun, midwife, or, in darker corners, witch. What they shared was knowledge, quiet, old, and rooted not in books, but in practice. They knew which root calmed fevers, which flower encouraged birth, which bark soothed madness. They also knew which combinations brought dreams, and which combinations brought death. Their knowledge was not abstract. It was lived, learned from mothers, grandmothers, wandering traders, silent monks, and sometimes from voices in the woods that no one else claimed to hear. In the world of altered mind, these keepers of secrets played a central role. They prepared the potions. They measured the smoke. They whispered what to expect. And they waited while others drifted into that second realm, the place of visions, of messages, of trembling truth. They watched over the ones who trembled in fevered ecstasy. They held hands when the darkness came too strong. They knew how to call someone back when the journey lingered too long. Their work was not always welcomed. The church increasingly viewed such knowledge with suspicion. Anything that altered the mind without prayer was questioned. Anything that did not carry the seal of Latin scripture was feared. And any woman, especially a poor one, who held knowledge over life, birth, death, or spirit, was dangerous. Still, the keepers continued. In monasteries, a different kind of knowledge bloomed. There were monks who kept gardens, physic gardens, where rows of medicinal and mystical plants grew under careful watch. These men recorded effects, dosages, combinations. In some abbeys, monks experimented with sedatives and spiritual enhancers, not for rebellion, but for revelation. They believed certain herbs helped deepen contemplation, that smoke from burning resin could lift the mind to holy heights, that a carefully brewed tea of mandrake and lavender might open the door to a true vision from God. But not all monks agreed. Some feared even the suggestion of altered mind. They saw it as a temptation, a deception, a tool of demons cloaked in the sweetness of dreams. So there were divisions. The keepers of secrets often walked alone. Many were women, old women, women who had delivered half the village's children and buried the rest. They were not always liked, but they were respected, until they weren't. Until a child died unexpectedly, until a man went mad after drinking the wrong brew, until the harvest failed. And then, whispers became accusations. She had herbs no one else recognized. She brewed by moonlight. She lived alone. She must be punished. Thus, many of the most knowledgeable were lost, not to time, but to fire, rope, or drowning. Their secrets buried in fear, their stories rewritten as warnings. But not all were silenced. Some escaped. Some passed their knowledge in coded recipes. Some taught in shadows, in songs, in metaphors. A brew for sleep was now dream water. A herb for vision became angel leaf. Meanings shifted. Knowledge hid. And so it survived. Today, you might walk a forest path and pass by the very plants they once used. You might see a cluster of henbane growing wild and not know its history. But the land remembers. And if you listen closely, so can we. Let us now enter the spaces where the mind left the body. Not in dreams, but in ritual, where smoke, shadow, and silence merged into something holy, terrifying, and unforgettable. Temples of the mind, rituals, darkness, and the doorway between worlds. Not all journeys take place with the body. Some happen in silence, behind closed doors, in the dark. In the medieval world, where the line between faith and fear was drawn with trembling hands, people created spaces for transformation. Not physical transformation, but inward turning, mental flight, soul bending. These were not cathedrals, nor pagan circles alone. They were simpler. A locked storeroom, a hut deep in the woods, a candlelit crypt beneath a chapel where no priest ventured after dark. A place set apart. Ritual was key. In these spaces, the mind was not set loose accidentally. It was guided gently into new terrain. Often, the process began with cleansing. A bath, not of luxury, but of necessity. Salt, ash, or herbs were added to water. The body was washed to remove the world, to make space for something else, something deeper. Clothes were removed or replaced with robes of rough wool or linen. Hair was tied back. Jewelry removed. The ordinary was shed like skin. Then came incense. A priest might burn frankincense before communion. A healer might use juniper or mugwort. The smoke curled through the air like a whisper from the unseen. It changed the scent of the space. It made the air feel alive. Often, the room was dim, lit only by a candle or a single oil lamp. Shadows danced on the walls. The flame flickered, slowed, as if time itself inhaled. There might be music, not sung, but droned. A hum, a chant, a string instrument plucked slowly over and over until the note became the only sound in the world. The rhythm of breath, of the heart, of the old world turning. Then the brew, sometimes drunk, sometimes eaten, sometimes smoked. It was not always a drug in the modern sense. It might be wine laced with herbs, a biscuit pressed with resin, a spoon of honey steeped with dream root. The keepers of secrets would know the recipe. It changed with the moon, the need, the person. No one rushed. To reach the doorway between worlds, you had to walk slowly. Once consumed, the body was still. You sat, or lay down, or knelt, and then you waited. The first sign was often warmth, a flush in the cheeks, a heaviness in the hands. Breath slowed, sound thickened. The room, unchanged, suddenly seemed vast, or small, or moving. And then the visions. Some saw landscapes, forests of red trees, oceans under stars, mountains made of glass. Some saw figures, angels, animals, ancestors, spirits, not in the way we see with eyes, but in the way we feel with memory. They were present. They were real. Some heard voices, gentle, commanding, familiar, speaking not in words, but in understanding. And some saw nothing, only silence, only stillness. And yet they returned changed. The experience varied. It was not predictable. It could not be ordered like a potion. It arrived as it wished. But when it did arrive, it left something behind. Insight, comfort, fear. Some called it madness. Some called it the divine. And always, when it ended, there was a return. The candle still burned. The room was still the same. The breath returned to normal. The limbs regained weight. And the person, no longer dreaming, opened their eyes. What they carried could not always be spoken. Some never spoke of it. Others tried, fumbling with words. I saw, they'd begin and then stop. Because how do you explain a feeling you did not have a name for? After the ritual, there was often food. Bread, soup, water. The ordinary brought back to comfort the soul. In some places, these rituals were sacred, guided by monks who believed in divine revelation. In others, they were secret, hidden, called witchcraft by those who did not understand. But they were not performances. They were not games. They were doors. And every time one opened, it reminded those present that the mind was not a prison. It was a temple. And temples, once entered, echo long after you leave. Let us now walk into the dreams themselves. Not visions seen by the eyes, but by the soul, where prophecy, memory, and the past intertwine. Dreams, spirits, and sacred madness, when the mind left the body. In the stillest hours of night, when even the dogs had gone quiet and the embers in the hearth glowed like breathing coals, people once believed that the soul could rise. Not in death, but in sleep, or something like it. To dream was not merely to imagine, it was to travel, to listen, to be visited, to be warned. And for many in the medieval world, dreams were not passive illusions, but messages. They came from God or the devil, from ancestors, from saints, from the dead, from parts of the self too deep to speak during the day, and sometimes from places beyond all names. Those who used herbs and ritual to alter their minds did not always call what they saw hallucinations. They called them visions. They called them visitations. Sometimes they called them burdens. There were dreamers who woke in cold sweat and refused to return to sleep. There were women who, during fever, spoke the names of unborn children or described distant lands they had never seen. There were monks who wrote down the words they heard in trance, phrases in Latin or Greek, sometimes in no language at all. Words that made no sense to them, yet haunted them for years. And there were the mad ones, the sacred mad. These were people who did not return fully from where their minds had gone, who wandered the village squares speaking in rhyme, who heard voices no one else could, who laughed at nothing or wept at stones. They were feared, pitied, sometimes stoned, sometimes revered, because every so often the mad one spoke true, spoke of death before it came, named a storm before it broke, pointed to a well before it ran dry. It was difficult to know who was chosen and who was cursed, and that, too, frightened the church. For in a world tightly bound by scripture and authority, a single dream could unravel order. A single voice, heard in sleep, could challenge a bishop, could cast doubt, could spark faith that was not approved. And yet, dreams persisted. In villages, people recorded dreams on bits of parchment. They drew what they saw on the walls of barns. They whispered their dreams to healers, who would interpret them using secret books or older methods, burning dried rosemary, measuring shadow lengths, consulting bones. Some dreams were simple, a sign to plant crops early, a warning to avoid a journey. Others were enormous, prophecies of plague, of angels, of entire kingdoms made of light. And still others were deeply personal, a visit from a dead parent, a conversation with a child not yet born, a question answered in silence. Under the influence of certain herbs, especially nightshade, henbane, or wild lettuce, these dreams deepened. They became lucid. The dreamer knew they were dreaming, and yet could not leave, could speak wakchus. Some called this soul travel, the idea that part of the self detached from the body and moved freely, untouched by time or space. There are records, scattered, hesitant, of midwives who dreamed births before they happened, of blind monks who claimed to see during trance, of children who, in sleep, spoke names only the dead should know. Not all of this was accepted. By the 14th century, many such dreamers were watched carefully, accused, labeled possessed or insane. But not everyone rejected them. In quiet corners of Europe, there were still those who believed in sacred madness, in the holy fool, in the thin places where the veil between worlds could be pierced, not just by scholars or priests, but by the poor, the grieving, the wild-hearted. And whether caused by herbs, by loss, by ritual, or by sheer mystery, those moments of piercing left marks. On the mind, on the soul, on history itself. Even now, when we dream deeply, who's to say we do not walk the same paths? Let us now turn to the rising shadow that fell upon these practices, the fear, the suspicion, and the fire that followed those who dared to dream too far. Fire and fear, when dreams became crimes. For a long time, the world allowed dreamers to dream. It tolerated their strange words, their plants, their powders and potions. It gave space, even if narrow, to those who walked at the edge of ordinary thought. But fear grows like mold, quietly and in the dark. By the late Middle Ages, the world had changed. War was common, famine more frequent. Plague came in black waves, swallowing cities, silencing whole villages. And when fear rises, so does the desire to control. Suddenly, the quiet dreamers became loud threats. The women with herb gardens were no longer wise, they were witches. The monks who burned resins were no longer devoted, they were heretics. The men who spoke with angels in dreams were said to be speaking with devils. And all around, the fires were built. The Inquisition spread like a slow storm, first in whispers, then in courts, then in executions. It began not with screams, but with silence. A neighbor who no longer spoke to you, a priest who avoided your eye, a letter delivered by hand, bearing a seal, demanding answers to questions you hadn't asked. The church, frightened by the chaos of disease and rebellion, sought order, doctrine, uniformity. And anything that could not be explained by scripture was labeled sin, or worse, sorcery. Dreams were no longer divine. Visions were no longer sacred. Herbs were no longer healing. They were dangerous. The Malleus Maleficarum, a book written in the 15th century, told the faithful how to identify witches. It spoke of flying ointments, of nocturnal journeys, of women who seduced the mind and body, of potions that brought pleasure, pain, and madness. It was not a book of science. It was a map of fear. And many who had once healed, who had spent their lives tending to the sick, helping births, guiding dreamers, were now hunted. Accusations came quickly. She walks alone at night. She grows plants that don't belong here. She talks in her sleep. He dreams things that come true. He smells of smoke and root. For those living on the edge of society, the poor, the old, the orphaned, the widowed, suspicion was a shadow that never lifted. And for those whose minds had truly touched the other side, those who had seen visions, real or imagined, divine or drugged, the risk was greatest. Because what they carried could not be seen, could not be proven, could not be tamed. Some were imprisoned, others tortured, many burned, and with each fire a little more knowledge turned to ash. The keepers of the old ways, those who knew which herbs softened grief, which teas deepened dream, hid what they knew, buried their books, burned their gardens, lived in silence. And the rituals, once practiced in flickering candlelight, vanished into memory. But not all was lost. Even as the fear rose, some resisted. In hidden rooms, rituals continued, muted, secret, sacred. In rural monasteries, certain monks still kept herbariums, cataloging the effects of plants that could not be spoken of. And in the oral traditions of midwives, travelers, and herbalists, the old knowledge lived on, disguised in lullabies and stories. They did not call it getting high. They did not call it magic. They called it knowing. Knowing how to ease pain, how to open a closed mind, how to remember the forgotten, and perhaps how to survive. Now, let us follow those who walked away from fire, who took their knowledge into exile, into hills, caves, forests, and monasteries, into pages wrapped in cloth, into memory. Let us walk with those who chose silence not out of fear, but as a form of protection. Hidden knowledge, survival through silence and song. After the smoke of the burnings cleared, after the cries of the condemned were swallowed by time, there was silence. But it was not empty silence. It was the silence of survival, of secrets wrapped in cloth and buried beneath floorboards, of songs that sounded like lullabies but carried recipes in rhyme, of gardens that looked ordinary but bloomed at night. The knowledge had not vanished. It had simply gone underground. Those who had once practiced openly, midwives, herbalists, mystics, learned to walk softly, to speak in metaphor, to look over their shoulders. They no longer called their potions visions or journeys. Instead, they called them resting teas, sleep dust, angel's balm. The names changed, but the ingredients often remained. Mandrake became devil's root. Belladonna became beautiful night. Henbane became whisper weed. The words danced around the truth like fog around the hills. In villages, old women passed their knowledge to daughters and nieces, but only in fragments, never all at once. A tea for grief, a rub for fever, a smoke for restless sleep. They said only what was needed and left the rest to be felt. Songs became tools of preservation. Simple melodies, sung while spinning wool or tending fields, carried more than music. A line about silver leaves under moonlight might mark when a plant should be picked. A verse about sleeping in the arms of clouds might describe a tea that carried one gently to unconsciousness. These songs were not written down. They were remembered, and through them, the old knowledge slipped past the fires and laws and eyes of fearful men. Even in monasteries, where the grip of doctrine was tightest, some monks continued to study plants. Hidden within Latin texts on agriculture or natural science were notes in the margins. Use only one petal. Add honey to soften the bitterness. Do not combine with wine. One monk's garden, described in a 14th century letter, included lavender, sage, wormwood, and nightshade. He called it his garden of grace and mercy, but the villagers whispered that his dreams were deeper than most. In these quiet places, knowledge endured. It endured because people still needed relief. The world did not stop hurting when the rituals were outlawed. Women still gave birth. Soldiers still returned wounded. Grief still soaked the ground like rain. And so the need remained. Sometimes a traveler, sick or sorrowful, would come to a village and ask for help. And someone somewhere would brew a tea, would say nothing, would light a candle, would watch over them as their breath slowed, as their body softened, as their mind stepped gently beyond the veil. It was not a ceremony anymore. It was not a rite. It was care. Care disguised as stillness. Care that had no name. And though many of these practices slowly faded, some remained, transformed, adapted, worn down like river stones. Today, they hide in folk medicine, in bedtime rituals, in the scent of herbs we cannot name but still find calming, in the songs our grandmothers hummed without knowing why, in the way we still associate certain smells, lavender, myrmint, with peace, with sleep, with the sense of being held by something older than ourselves. Knowledge survives in curious ways. It survives not in grand libraries or university halls, but in rhythm, in breath, in the way a hand stirs a pot, in the pause before a story is told. And when you hear it, you'll know. Not because the words are loud, but because they echo, like memory waking up inside you. Let us now walk further, not in silence, but in song, into the realm of the dangerous plants themselves. Their beauty, their power, and the thin line between healing and harm. The beautiful and the deadly, a walk through the poison garden. There are gardens that bloom for beauty, and then there are gardens that bloom for power. The medieval poison garden was never marked with signs. It was often hidden, behind a wall, in the shade of a cloister, along the edge of a forgotten field. But those who needed it knew it. They walked the paths with reverence and with fear, because these were not plants to pluck or crush without thought. These were teachers, and if disrespected, executioners. Their names were whispered: belladonna, mandragora, hyoscyamus, datura, aconitum, hemlock, wolfsbane, henbane, each a syllable with centuries of weight. Let us walk, slowly, through their leaves. Belladonna, the beautiful lady, was perhaps the most seductive of all. With her deep purple berries and shining green leaves, she looked harmless, lovely, even. But she was not. A few berries, plucked by the hand of a child, could bring silence forever. And yet, women once used drops of belladonna juice to dilate their pupils, believing it made them more alluring. It did. And it also blurred their vision, brought headaches, tremors, hallucinations. In the right dose, it could ease pain or induce trance. In the wrong dose, it could drag the heart into stillness. Mandrake, the twisted root, human-shaped and shrouded in legend. Said to scream when pulled from the ground. Said to bring madness or love or death. It was buried deep, its root often split like legs, its scent thick and strange. A small piece might be brewed into sleep draughts. A larger piece, well, no one dared. Mandrake was both feared and adored. Kept in linen, wrapped in cloth, anointed with wine and fed bits of food like a pet. Some believed it would protect the home. Others swore it cursed their sleep. It lived between myth and medicine, like a god that had fallen into dirt. Henbane, with its pale yellow petals and black-purple veins, was not a flower for joy. It was used in flying ointments, in sedative drafts, and sometimes in beer by those who wanted stronger dreams. Its effects? Dry mouth, wild visions, staggering confusion, time bent like melted wax. To the mystic, it opened the veil. To the untrained, it could end the story. Aconite, also called wolfsbane, grew like a warning. Blue, bold. Its roots could stop a heart. It was used, rarely and carefully, to numb pain, especially before amputation. But it was also slipped into goblets and bowls when silence was desired. Poison in stories and in real life. Soldiers once rubbed it on spearheads. Hunters used it for wolves. But it was also used by those desperate to forget the cold, the war, the grief. A small dose, a long sleep, maybe a dream without end. Datura, with its trumpet-shaped flowers that bloomed at night, was both enchanting and terrible. It blurred reality like mist on a mirror. Users spoke of flying, of burning stars, of voices in their heads. But it was unpredictable. One man might weep with joy. Another might run into fire. Another might never wake again. In some texts, it is listed as sacred. In others, cursed. That duality, beauty, and danger is what defines these plants. They were not evil. They were not good. They were strong. And strength, in a world of imbalance, always comes with risk. In the hands of the skilled, these plants were medicine. In the hands of the desperate, escape. In the hands of the cruel, weapons. But in all cases, they demanded respect. That respect often came in the form of ritual. Never pick at night. Never taste before speaking a prayer. Never mix root with seed. Never touch with blood on your hands. Superstition? Perhaps. But in a time without laboratories or dosimeters, superstition was safety. Today, some of these plants still grow wild. Others are cultivated in museums, in sealed gardens with signs that read, "Do not touch, do not inhale, do not ingest." And yet they bloom as they always have, as they always will, quiet, strange, waiting. Let us now step away from the plants themselves and return to those who used them for comfort, not power. Those who, in a cruel and cold world, saw in these herbs not poison, but peace. Let us enter the realm of grief and dreams, where the mind turned to plants not for vision, but for rest. Asleep without pain, the gift and risk of forgetting. There are times when the greatest miracle is not a vision of angels, nor a dance with shadows, but a full night of sleep. In the Middle Ages, pain was not rare. It was constant. It was stitched into the fabric of life, in the aching joints of old age, in the hollow stomachs of famine, in the cries of women in labor, in the wounds of soldiers, in the slow death of fevered children. There was no morphine, no aspirin, no warm hospital beds. And so, when a person could sleep deeply, dreamlessly, it was seen not just as rest, but as mercy. For this reason, many of the mind-altering herbs that grew in secret gardens and monastery walls were not taken to see visions, but to silence suffering. These were not the bold rituals of mystics or the fevered dreams of seers. These were the quiet preparations of caretakers, often women, who wanted nothing more than to ease a husband's pain, a child's fear, or their own long sorrow. In herbal texts written in Latin and Old French, one finds simple instructions. Boil poppy with wine until the color changes. Add honey. Give in sips before dusk. For pain that does not pass, crush nightshade root and bind with lamb fat. Rub gently into the neck. There are no promises, only hope. Hope that the person would fall asleep and wake lighter, or not wake at all, and pass quietly without screaming into the cold. To forget, even briefly, was a gift, because pain in those days was not just of the body, it was in the air. The smell of death lingered in cities. The sound of coughing echoed through stone homes. Mothers buried more children than they raised. Wives became widows before 30. Entire families vanished in the time it took to say a prayer. And when the world would not offer peace, the people turned to the plants that might. They took wild lettuce, a cousin of modern opium, known then as Lactuca virosa. They steeped it with wine and ash, and gave it to restless men too wounded to speak. They burned juniper, not just to cleanse air, but to slow the breath of those dying from plague. The smoke filled the room like a blanket. They used valerian, still known today, to calm crying infants. And hops, not just for ale, but for sleep pillows, soft bags sewn with herbs, placed beneath heads at night. Not all sleep was peaceful. Some who drank the wrong brew wandered in nightmares they could not wake from. Some fell into comas that never lifted. Some confused forgetting with freedom, and sought the silence too often, too deeply, until they no longer returned. But even knowing the risk, they kept drinking. Because in a world where pain had no remedy, even the illusion of comfort was worth the gamble. There are stories of soldiers begging for mandrake before surgery, of mothers rocking their children while whispering herbal prayers, of old men who requested the black tea before their final hour. And through it all, sleep became sacred. It was not laziness. It was not weakness. It was protection. From memory. From despair. From the screaming world. And those who knew how to give it, who held the recipes, who stirred the pots, who sang the lullabies, were not seen as witches or magicians. They were seen as merciful, until, of course, the world changed again. Until the laws were written, and the knowledge condemned, and the women were burned. But their legacy remains, not in spellbooks, not in grimoires, but in the very idea that sleep is a right. That comfort, even brief, is worth protecting. That the mind deserves rest. Today, we have pills, dosages, warning labels. But the yearning is the same. To lie down, to close the eyes, to let go, to forget for just a while the heaviness of being. And in that forgetting, to remember something older than pain, peace. Let us now turn from pain to something stranger, not the desire to sleep, but the desire to see. The pursuit of prophecy, messages, and signs, and how people followed their visions into madness, mysticism, and meaning. The prophets and the possessed, when visions became a language of power. There are moments in history when the dreamer becomes a leader, when the person who sees what others cannot becomes the one they follow. In the medieval world, visions were not always dismissed. Sometimes they were feared, but sometimes they were embraced. Sometimes the person who saw beyond the veil was called a prophet. Sometimes they became dangerous. There were women who woke from trances and spoke of fires that had not yet come, and when they did, the village remembered her words. There were men who, after nights of delirium and herbs, declared the birth of a new age, and crowds gathered at their feet. Not all visionaries were mad. Not all were wise. Some were both. Some were neither. But their words moved people, and in a world ruled by kings and bishops, that made them powerful. It began quietly. A dream. A whisper. A pattern in the stars. Then came the speaking, under trees, in markets, near wells. People stopped to listen. What if it was true? She says the sickness will end. He says the crops will fail. She speaks with the voice of Mary. He walks with a crow that never leaves. And suddenly, the dreamer is no longer alone. People bring food, offer coins, ask questions, plead for blessings, demand predictions. The dreamer becomes a conduit, a mirror, a flame, but fire draws attention. Soon, the church notices. The local lord hears, and questions follow. Who told you these things? By what authority do you speak? Are you hearing the voice of God, or of something darker? Because if the prophet says what the church agrees with, they are called holy. And if they don't, they are called possessed. In this fragile balance, many visionaries teetered. Some tried to explain that they had taken only herbs, that they meant no harm, that the dreams were accidents. Others embraced the power and let the visions lead them further. There were groups who followed these people into the wilderness, formed communes, waited for the end of days. There are scrolls that speak of the woman who fasted for 40 days and saw the river turn red, of the boy who fell ill awoke and named the unborn child of the priest's wife. There were monks who meditated until their bodies trembled and claimed they had spoken with Michael, or seen the devil, or glimpsed the bones of saints glowing in the dark. There were children, small, unlettered, who woke from fever with songs no one had taught them. And each time this happened, those in power had to decide, is this inspiration or infection? The line between prophecy and possession was razor thin. Some were paraded as miracles, others chained in cellars or drowned in wells. There are reports, scattered across letters and chronicles, of those brought before councils, asked to describe their visions, pressed with questions, threatened with flame. A woman in southern France, in the 13th century, claimed to see a glowing figure each night who dictated scripture. She was tested for madness. She passed. The bishop blessed her. 10 years later, she had a vision that warned of a coming war and said the church would fall. She was burned within a week, because truth is only welcomed when it is convenient, and visions only comfort when they confirm what is already believed. Yet the visions never stopped, because herbs continued to grow, dreams continued to speak, and the mind, fragile, powerful, unpredictable, kept reaching toward something greater than itself. In hidden corners, people still gathered to listen, still closed their eyes and waited, still believed that between the breath and the silence, something holy might arrive. Today, we call many of these people mad, but perhaps they were simply open to a world we have forgotten how to see. Let us now walk deeper still, into the places where symbols replaced words, where rituals replaced reason, and where secret groups guarded what the world tried to erase. Symbols and shadows, the secret societies of herbal memory. When words became dangerous, people turned to symbols. A circle etched on a door, a star carved beneath a table, a sprig of dried herb tied with a red thread and hung in a window only at full moon. They were not decorations. They were messages, not for the curious, but for those who already knew how to read. In the late Middle Ages, as church authority tightened and the fires of persecution spread across Europe, the old ways did not vanish. They slipped beneath the surface, where secrecy was survival. Knowledge, once spoken freely, now traveled in codes. Herbal texts disguised as poetry, recipes woven into embroidery, prayers that rhymed in peculiar ways, holding meaning only to those taught which words to emphasize, which verses to skip. From these hushed efforts grew networks, not grand conspiracies, but small, fragile connections. Between midwives in distant towns, between monks who swapped herbal notes beneath the guise of agricultural trade, between women who met in fields under pretense of gathering wildflowers. These were not witches with pointed hats and wands. They were caretakers of forgotten things, custodians of comfort, and they began to mark each other with signs. A ring worn upside down, a scar shaped like a crescent, a bracelet of braided wool and bone, a pendant carved with a plant that no longer grew in that region. The marks were subtle, and they had to be, because with each century, the cost of being different increased. To be a woman alone, with knowledge of pain and plants, was to be suspect. To own a book written in symbols was to invite accusation. To dream deeply, to speak of stars, to offer comfort that smelled of roots instead of incense, was to risk ruin. And so, the circles formed. Small gatherings, quiet meetings, sometimes in cellars, sometimes in woods, always after dusk. They lit no fires. They carried no banners. They simply shared what had been remembered, what had worked, what had failed, who had been lost, what could be passed on. And they taught each other how to preserve without being caught. Recipes disguised as household charms. For a peaceful child, sow 7 poppy seeds into the hem of the nightgown. To ease labor, tie a blue string around the left wrist before the crow caws. To forget a sorrow, bury rosemary in a shoe and walk west before dusk. To outsiders, these were odd superstitions. To the initiated, they were medicine. Some say these societies were nothing more than rumor, that there were no codes, no circles, no hidden books. But then why did certain signs appear in distant regions? Why did the same herb rhyme show up in Italy and northern France, with the same mistakes? Why do we find pressed plants inside hymnals from the 1500s, annotated not in Latin, but in strange personal scripts? The truth is soft. It resists loud questions. But it lingers, in fragments, in symbols, in songs passed down with no known author. These quiet protectors of herbal knowledge may never have called themselves a group. They had no leader, no name, but they shared one goal: to remember what the world tried to forget, to hold on to the comfort, the vision, the relief, and to pass it along in whispers. Even today, echoes of their work remain. A grandmother who keeps dried lavender under her pillow and says it keeps the dreams kind. A rural healer who learned her teas not from school, but from her father's sister, who never married and who always planted on moonless nights. A symbol carved into an old wooden beam, faint now, but once freshly drawn, of a flower that no longer grows nearby. Let us now turn from secrecy to sacredness, to the ways in which even the church, fearful as it was, could not completely turn away from the power of altered mind, and sometimes even embraced it in its rituals and incense-laced sanctuaries. Smoke in the sanctuary, incense, ecstasy, and the church's quiet trance. Not all paths to altered mind lay in forests or hidden gardens. Some passed through stained glass, through halls of stone and vaulted ceilings, through the long echo of chants in candlelit cathedrals. The medieval church, despite its fear of heresy, its persecution of mystics and healers, was no stranger to the transcendent. It too sought ecstasy, only it cloaked it in robes and ritual. In every cathedral, incense swung from silver chains. It spilled from thuribles in rhythmic arcs, forming clouds that wrapped around marble columns, drifted into beams of colored light, and fell over kneeling bodies like fog from heaven. The scent, frankincense, myrrh, cedar, benzoin, was not chosen by chance. These resins were known for more than holiness. They calmed the mind, slowed the breath, induced a sense of peace, and in large quantities, in a closed space, under soft light and solemn music, they changed perception. Priests knew this. So did monks. It was not intoxication as the village might know it, not visions of demons or flights through dream space, but it was a dilution of reality, a softening, the repetition of chant, the swaying of incense, the warmth of candlelight, the taste of wine and bread, all combined into a kind of sacred hypnosis. For some, this brought communion with God. For others, It brought something harder to name. There are quiet records, tucked in monastery letters and the marginalia of hymns, of brothers who wept during Mass and claimed to see light pour from the ceiling, of nuns who fell into trances during prayer and awoke with words they did not remember writing, of saints who levitated, spoke languages they had never learned, heard voices that came not from men. And though the Church feared such things when found among peasants or women or wanderers, within its own sanctuaries, it made room. It called these moments grace. It labeled the visions divine ecstasy, and in doing so, preserved a kind of mystical experience that the world was otherwise trying to erase. In cloister gardens, monks grew herbs not just for medicine, but for meditation. Lavender, lemon balm, angelica, and even small, carefully hidden patches of opium poppy, all tended with precision, all understood for their ability to aid in long vigils, in restless nights, in prayer that bordered on trance. Monks and nuns fasted, not merely for purity, but to enter altered states. They deprived the body of food, warmth, comfort, and when the world faded, the visions came. In illuminated manuscripts, we see hints of this: angels with too many eyes, patterns that spiral like dreams, saints surrounded by strange halos that swirl like smoke. This was not madness. This was devotion, shaped by environment, repetition, and sometimes by incense that altered the mind just enough to see differently, to feel beyond flesh, to hear the silence beneath the psalm. The Church did not call this getting high. It never would. But what is incense, if not inhalation? What is fasting, if not shifting the brain's chemistry? What is chant, if not rhythm to break ordinary thought? And what is faith, if not a journey toward something unseen? In this way, the Church was not separate from the traditions it tried to suppress. It simply renamed them, regulated them, dressed them in gold and Latin. But the sensation, the drifting of the self into something softer, larger, luminous, remained the same. Let us now turn to those outside the Church, to the women whose trance was not accepted, whose ecstasy was not written in books, but still held immense, dangerous power. Let us return to the earth, to the moonlight, and to the edge of what could not be controlled. Witches, midwives, and the wild mind, power beyond permission. In the corners of medieval Europe, in mossy cottages, smoky kitchens, and hillside clearings, lived women who knew things they were never supposed to know. They had no titles, no sermons, no permission, but they had power, and the world never quite forgave them for it. These were the midwives, the herbalists, the widows, the wise women, the ones who whispered in pain, sang in birth, and prayed not to cathedrals, but to earth, wind, moon, and root. They brewed teas that calmed, oils that soothed, rubs that stopped trembling hands. They helped children breathe easier and helped the old die without screaming. But they also did something else. They helped people feel again. They made space for dreams. In the dark of night, they brewed mixtures that did not just numb pain but opened the inner eye. They wrapped women in furs soaked in herbs and sang as visions began. They led the grieving into quiet woods and let them weep while fires burned low and smoke spiraled toward stars. They guided trances, though they would never have used the word. They called it letting the spirit breathe. They called it loosening the grief. They called it the deep, soft sleep. But in those moments, under herb and moon, smoke and chant, minds opened. People returned from those places changed. And change, to power, is always dangerous. So the world gave them a name, witch. It was a name made of fear and fire. A name that could burn books, homes, bodies. A name that turned midwives into criminals, healers into threats, dreamers into monsters. And yet, the name never touched the truth. Because what these women offered was not rebellion, it was care. It was comfort where medicine had none. It was presence where priests had left. It was knowledge in a world that had forgotten its own body. They understood the rhythm of bleeding and blooming, of tides, of roots that only grew in certain soils. They understood how the mind responded to scent, to warmth, to sound. And they knew that the mind, when softened, could see things others missed. A grief hidden in a stiff neck, a fear lodged in the stomach, a vision pressing at the edges of someone's silence. And when they saw these things, they did not preach. They prepared. A bundle of wormwood and rosemary to sleep, a handful of poppy seeds and milk, a cloth soaked in valerian to place on the chest, a chant, repeated softly, not to summon spirits, but to soothe them. These were not spells. These were not curses. They were gestures of love, passed hand to hand, and feared deeply by those who could not understand them, because they could not be taxed, could not be printed, could not be fenced in by gold or doctrine. They belonged to the wild, to the fields, the winds, the rain, to the breath of women who had no one left but each other. Some were caught, burned, but many survived. They did so by changing the way they moved, by hiding their plants among vegetables, by calling their rituals chores, by singing to themselves instead of to crowds. They became smaller, quieter, but never gone. Their fingerprints still mark the edges of history. In the teas passed down with no explanation. In the dreams that follow the scent of lavender. In the sudden memory of something you've never learned, but somehow always known. They are not gone. They are waiting. And they remind us that the mind, like the earth, cannot be owned, only touched. Let us now follow that touch into the final gift of these ancient ways, not to escape, not to forget, not even to dream, but to awaken something deeper, something rooted, something sacred and alive within us. Rooted spirit, the union of mind, body, and earth. Not every journey begins in search of ecstasy. Some begin with pain, others with silence. But the deepest ones, the ones that leave no scars, only softness, begin with longing. A longing not for flight or fire, but for belonging, for reconnection. And that is what many of the altered states in the medieval world were truly about. Not spells, not spectacle, but the slow return to something the soul had forgotten, that the body, the mind, and the earth were once the same thing. The old women knew this. The monks felt it in their gardens. The visionaries whispered it in fevered breath. And those who drank the bitter teas, who lay on mossy floors with eyes wide open to visions, did not come back shouting of gods or demons, but with tears, not of fear, but of remembering. Remembering that the heartbeat does not end at the skin, that the wind is not separate from thought, that the smell of crushed time beneath bare feet can unlock a door in the mind you didn't know was closed. In these forgotten rituals, under trees, behind abbey walls, in smoke-filled huts, people didn't just alter their minds. They returned to them. They made space for the body to speak, in twitches and warmth and sighs, for the heart to loosen, for the breath to lengthen, for the senses to expand beyond logic. This wasn't getting high. It was getting low, sinking into the bones of being, into the quiet soil of the self. They called it different names. The still dark, the root hour, the prayer without words. And often, it came with the simplest things. A clay cup warmed by fire, a leaf chewed slowly in silence, a song hummed without tune, a touch on the shoulder that said, "Stay." There are records of people who went into the woods alone, not to vanish, but to rejoin something, to sit with trees, to bury hands in ash and bark and root, to let the world fall away until only the pulse remained, not the pulse of blood, but the pulse of life itself. And when they returned, they spoke differently. Not louder, quieter, more slowly. They looked longer before speaking. They stood barefoot longer before walking. They listened to birds as if the birds had stories to tell. Because perhaps they did. Because perhaps the point was never to leave this world, but to see it again, as it really was. Beneath the noise, beneath the fear, alive. And if certain herbs, certain smoke, certain rituals helped the mind remember that, then perhaps they were never truly medicine or magic or madness. Perhaps they were mirrors, held up to the soul. And in that reflection, strange, fragrant, fleeting, we remembered the oldest truth of all. We are not separate, not from earth, not from body, not even from the parts of our minds we fear the most. Let us now turn to the fragile threads that remain today, the scattered, flickering echoes of this forgotten world, and ask, what still survives? And what have we lost forever? Echoes in the present, what the world still remembers. History never truly ends. Even as cathedrals crumble and languages fade, something lingers, not in the books, but in the body, in instinct, in memory without words. And so, though the fires were lit and the books were burned and the gardens were razed, something survived. Something always does. You can still find it if you know how to listen. In the whisper of dried lavender slipped into a child's pillow. In the warm mug passed between trembling hands, made of chamomile, honey, lemon balm. In the strange comfort you feel when walking through a pine forest, inhaling the air like a prayer. These are not accidents. They are echoes. Echoes of a time when people listened to the land not for profit, but for peace. When a single leaf could mean relief, when a song could carry a hidden cure, when a silence around a fire was the deepest kind of medicine. Today we speak of wellness, of mindfulness, of natural remedies, of organic living. We light incense in yoga studios. We wear essential oils. We speak of grounding and centering and detoxing. We track the phases of the moon. We soak in warm water and call it self-care. But these are not inventions of the modern age. They are rememberings, fragmented, yes, commercialized, often, but still rooted in something far older than our modern vocabulary. A bath with rosemary is not new. A dream pillow is not trendy. A walk under the full moon, a pause before speaking, a hand pressed to the earth. These are the last surviving threads of a tapestry once vast and vibrant. You can find these threads in unexpected places. In the old women who still gather herbs in the early morning, even if they no longer know why. In the quiet man who speaks to trees and is laughed at, yet somehow always knows when the storms are coming. In the songs passed down in kitchens. In the hands that mix oil and beeswax without recipe. In the hush that falls over a room when someone begins to chant, even if no one understands the words. It lives in the collective longing we all carry, the one that pulls us out of cities, away from screens, into woods, onto mountaintops, beside oceans. It is not escape. It is return to something that once soothed us, that once reminded us we are not machines, that we are soft, tired, sacred. Of course, much has been lost. There are recipes no longer remembered. Plants that no longer grow, words erased from stone, names unspoken, women whose knowledge died with them, men whose visions were silenced. And yet, not everything needs to be written to survive. Some things live in rhythm, in instinct, in the breath that deepens when you smell sage, in the stillness that comes when the world is quiet enough to hear your own heartbeat. The world still remembers. Just enough. And so, we find ourselves, centuries later, still drinking teas for sleep, still burning herbs for calm, still dreaming of something more than what we see. Let us now enter the final chambers of this journey, where the soul speaks softly, The plants grow in forgotten corners, and the question is no longer how to remember, but whether we're ready to listen. The language of the forgotten. When the body speaks in roots and smoke, the body speaks in quiet ways. It speaks in warmth behind the eyes, in a chill that rises for no reason, in the soft sigh that escapes after the first sip of tea, in the stillness that comes when the light shifts, just so, at the end of day. It speaks in ways that words cannot. And in the old world, the one with cracked stone floors and wooden bowls and candlelight, people listened to that language, because it was the only one that told the truth. When a woman crushed leaves between her fingers, she didn't ask if the plant was medicinal. She waited to feel the tingle on her skin, the tightening of breath, the memory of something stirring. When a man stood in a room filled with mugwort smoke, he didn't ask what it was supposed to do. He closed his eyes. And if his grief lessened, if his hands stopped shaking, then the plant had spoken. This was not superstition. This was intuition refined by generations. An alphabet of sensation. The medieval world had no MRIs, no chemistry sets, no warning labels. What they had were bodies, aching, weary, holy. They paid attention. They noticed how valerian relaxed the jaw, how rosemary brought alertness, how wormwood cooled the heat of anger. They didn't study active compounds. They studied reactions in the stomach, in the heart, in the soul. They understood that not all knowing is written. Some is felt, in bone and breath, in the flicker of a candle that calms the mind, in the shift from panic to presence after smelling crushed thyme. They trusted that their bodies could tell them when something was right or wrong long before their minds could name it. This is the language of the forgotten, not because it no longer exists, but because we've stopped listening. We ask for evidence, and yet ignore the sudden tears when a certain song plays. We ask for science, and yet look away from the ache in our chest that says, this place, this moment, this person means something. But the body still remembers. It remembers the scent of rain-soaked earth. It remembers the way lavender settles the breath. It remembers the rhythm of walking under trees. And it remembers that once, long ago, the mind did not live alone. It lived among roots and smoke and sky. There are people today who speak this language still. They do not always wear robes or titles. They might be gardeners, nurses, grandparents, musicians, people who make soup slowly, people who light candles without needing a reason. You may know someone like this. You may be someone like this. You may find one day that you instinctively place your hand on a tree, or hold a stone too long, or breathe more deeply than usual in the presence of rosemary, and wonder why. You don't need to know why. The knowing is in the doing. And that is the point. Because when we listen to our own bodies, not to correct them, but to remember with them, we recover the old wisdom. The slow wisdom. The soft wisdom that lives not in thoughts, but in pulses. And perhaps that's what the medieval world, beneath all the fear and fire and forgetting, truly offered. A reminder that there is knowledge beneath the skin. And it speaks in warmth, in scent, in song, in stillness. Let us now turn to the dream, the final vision, of what might happen if this wisdom were no longer hidden. What would it look like to live again in rhythm with roots and breath? If we remember a vision of the world rewoven. What if we remembered, not just in books or classes or documentaries, but in our bones? What if we woke one morning and felt, without knowing why, the need to walk barefoot through dew-soaked grass? What if we paused before dinner, not to scroll a screen, but to smell a sprig of thyme crushed between our fingers, as if it held a story older than language? What if we whispered not to summon spirits, but to soften the moment? What would the world look like if we returned to the rhythm it once had? In this vision, there are no witches or heretics, only humans. tending small gardens, drying leaves in sunlight, stirring pots with purpose, singing while they work, not because they must, but because the act itself is sacred. Children learn plants the way they learn colors. Elders sit not in silence, but in wisdom. Pain is not feared, but gently acknowledged, and treated not with dismissal, but with presence. Grief is not hidden. It is honored. In this vision, the line between medicine and ritual vanishes. A bath becomes a ceremony. A walk becomes a healing. A cup of tea becomes communion. Not every herb is magic. Not every leaf heals. But the act of paying attention to flavor, to breath, to the shift in one's heart when steam rises, becomes the true medicine. Time slows. Or maybe it doesn't. But we begin to notice it. We stop asking time to serve us and begin to walk with it. Seasons matter again. We plant on moon cycles, not as superstition, but as relationship. We pause in winter. We open in spring. We burn briefly in summer. We let go in autumn. We remember that we are not separate from trees, but made of the same stories, growing slowly, rooted deeply, bending toward light. In this vision, altered states are not escapes. They are returns. A carefully prepared tea is not indulgence. It is language. A moment of trance is not madness. It is meeting. And the word "hi" disappears entirely, because the experience is no longer vertical. It is not a ladder or a mountain. It is circular, like a bowl, like a womb, like a ring of women singing, like the rhythm of a drum, like the spiral of smoke rising from cedar. We come home not by climbing, but by sinking into the now, the breath, the root. In this world, there are still fires, still sorrow, still illness and war and noise. But there is also a place, quiet, nearby, where we go not to fix, but to feel. And there, someone waits with a bundle of herbs, not to sell, not to promise, but to offer, to hold, to remember, and to remind us of the oldest truth, that healing does not always mean curing. Sometimes it means belonging again. Let us now begin to close the circle, not with answers, but with gratitude, and walk gently toward the final moments of this journey, where silence becomes the last and deepest medicine. The final silence, what we lose, what we carry. Eventually, all stories end in silence. The fire dims, the smoke thins, the voice falls still, and in that silence, we are left to wonder, what did we truly learn? What remains? What have we lost? And what, without even knowing, have we begun to carry? So much has vanished. The exact recipes, the chants that never reached parchment, the secret meetings beneath trees now cut down, the faces of those who were never painted, whose wisdom was never preserved. The knowledge that lived in hands, not in books, is dust now, carried by the wind, buried beneath stone. And yet, silence is not emptiness. It is a container, a bowl still warm from what was held in it. And if we lean in, not with ears, but with our breath, we can still feel the echo of all that was. We feel it when we stand before an ancient forest and cannot speak. We feel it when we hold someone's hand and say nothing, and it is enough. We feel it when we dream of places we've never seen and wake with tears on our face. The mind remembers. The soul remembers. Even when history forgets. This is the paradox of endings. We mourn what is lost, even as it begins to grow in us. The old midwives may be gone, but every time someone prepares a remedy from what grows in their yard, they return. The monks may no longer burn resin in prayer, but every time someone lights incense and closes their eyes, they are remembered. The wandering dreamers may be nameless, but every time someone listens to the voice that comes in sleep, they live again. We carry them, in our gestures, in our instincts, in the sudden stillness that falls before a storm when we do not speak, because something in us is listening. Perhaps this is the final gift of the medieval world, not the names of herbs or the mechanics of trance, or even the stories of fire and fear, but the permission to stop, to feel, to wonder, to say, I do not know what this means, but I know it means something. And in that moment, we are no longer lost. We are part of the story again, not as historians, but as human beings, walking slowly, holding silence, trusting that the truth does not need to be explained, only remembered. Let us now walk together one last time into the final chapter. Not an ending, but a return. To breath, to root, to rest. The return, where all paths led home. Every path, no matter how twisted, no matter how shadowed, eventually curves inward and brings us home. Not always to a place, not always to people, but to something inside us that was waiting, quietly, patiently, like a fire that never went out, only smoldered. This is where we arrive now, not with fanfare, not with revelation, but with the slow exhale of someone who has wandered far and now recognizes the shape of their own silence. We have walked through dreams and herbs, through smoke and song, through the stories of women who healed without permission and monks who prayed with trembling hands. We've touched mandrake roots and traced invisible symbols into dust. We have watched what was sacred become feared. We have seen how knowledge hides, not because it is ashamed, but because the world has forgotten how to receive it. We have felt the ache of lost language, and the deep, wordless joy of remembering without explanation. And through it all, something has followed us. The breath, the steady, quiet rhythm of being alive. In the end, no matter how many herbs we name, how many rituals we study, how many visions we describe, it always returns to this. The inhale, the pause, the exhale, everything we've spoken of, the teas, the smokes, the songs, the trances, all of it was only ever trying to bring us back to what breath already knows. That stillness is a door. That presence is a prayer. That the mind, when softened, reveals not chaos, but connection. So we return, not to recreate the past, not to escape the present, but to reroute, to feel the warmth of a cup in our hands and know it matters, to place our feet on the ground and remember we are not above it, not separate from it, but of it, to light a candle not for magic, but for meaning, to fall asleep not in fear, but in trust, and in doing so, to carry forward something deeper than knowledge, a way of being, a way of walking slowly, listening fully, and touching the world with gentleness. Because once, long ago, in a time of cold stone and warm herbs, of burning fires and whispered chants, there were people who remembered how to live like this. And now, so do you. Welcome home. We began with a question, not one asked aloud, but one that lingers beneath the surface of modern life. What did they know that we have forgotten? We traced the answer through shadowed monasteries and smoke-filled cottages, through bitter roots and whispered songs, through the trembling hands of midwives and the silent visions of monks, through trances wrapped in linen and knowledge buried in ash. We saw how the desire to feel differently, to see differently, was not rebellion. It was survival. It was reverence. It was the ancient longing to belong to something larger than the world of war, of suffering, of rigid control. And we saw how that longing took form. In teas, in smoke, in dreams, in silence. We watched those who reached for comfort and those who were punished for it. We sat with the women who dared to ease pain even when the price was fire. We walked with those who turned away from fear and toward the unknown. And we discovered that what they sought was not intoxication, not escape, not power. What they sought was peace, soft peace, rooted peace, The kind that asks nothing but attention. The kind that grows only in stillness. In our time, so much feels fast, artificial, and yet, the echo of the old world is still with us. In your breath. In the scent of mint when torn between fingers. In the way your eyes close when the tea is just right. In the hush that falls when you light a candle and forget, for a moment, the weight you carry. That is where the memory lives now. Not in scrolls or spells or books of the dead, but in you. You are the archive. The soil is still beneath your feet. The herbs still grow. The body still knows how to listen. The soul still knows how to speak. And somewhere, beyond all the noise, the quiet waits. Like a forest you once knew but haven't visited in years. Waiting, not to teach you something new, but to remind you of what you never truly forgot.